Hang on, guys. Something's looking a little sus on the camera work here. There we go. Color correction the way the vampires intended. How is it that one of the most hated film franchises of all time, the Twilight Saga, with 5 movies, not a single one scoring above 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, how is it that this film franchise also happened to have some of the best soundtracks ever? Just setting off the idea for making this video had me sniffing around like a set of vampires around Bella Swan. I've been very interested in this topic, and I've thought about doing this, but I finally took the plunge, re-listened to all of the albums, because something that I've been saying for over a decade at this point is that even if you hate the Twilight movies, you can appreciate the music that it introduced young audiences to. Hold tight, Spider Monkey, because we're going to touch on the soundtrack for Twilight, New Moon, Eclipse, Breaking Dawn Part 1, and Breaking Dawn Part 2, all in one video, all also while discussing who actually put these together, what was the purpose, what was the intent, and how did they score all of these indie, punk, and alternative artists? I'm talking Muse, I'm talking Vampire Weekend, The Joy Formidable, Bon Iver, The Killers, Metric, Florence and the Machine, Thom, Yorke, Bats for Lashes, Grizzly Bear, Paramore.
Are you fucking kidding me?
Whether you love or hate the Twilight Saga, you can't deny the pop culture impact of these movies and of the soundtracks, because we're probably now seeing people come of age that were really young, teenagers that were getting into these movies, into the soundtracks, and even if they moved on from the movies and don't feel the same way about them, maybe they introduced them to some of the most important artists of their lifetime. So I was a 15-year-old boy when the first Twilight movie came out. I did not have a Team Edward or Team Jacob preference. It was not targeted towards me, but somehow my senior year of high school, 2 years later, my girlfriend at the time convinced me to watch all 3 of the first movies in a single day, the first 2 at her house, and then we would go see Eclipse in theaters. It was certainly a different brand of torture, but she baited me by showing me the soundtracks and saying, hey, you know, you like a lot of these artists, maybe you want to go see Muse and see where this ends up in the movie. Yes, I have seen all 5 Twilight movies. Don't ask me why. I think I was just so far in at that point that I'd already seen 3, so why not see the other 2? I also made a parody on my old comedy channel back in the day where we did a trailer parody of Breaking Dawn Part 1. If you've somehow seen that ancient video I made, then you know that I used an instrumental track by Angus and Julia Stone, Big Jet Plane. I discovered that duo because of the Twilight soundtrack. Love Will Take You was on the Breaking Dawn Part 1 soundtrack, and it also actually admittedly got me into other acts like Florence and the Machine, because I used to work at a movie theater. When this franchise was coming out, all of these movies were coming, and teenage girls were pouring in masse. Even though this was a second run theater that I was working at, we would get them like a couple of months after the regular theater. We were getting all of the teenagers that were seeing this movie for like the 5th time, and somehow they were even more excited. The movies are entertaining to watch because they can be that certain brand of so bad it's good. I see why it was important in pop culture, and I really don't have anything against them. In fact, Kristen Stewart has become one of my favorite actresses. I love Rob Pattinson as well, and The Lighthouse. I can't wait to see him in The Batman. And I really appreciate Twilight and their music supervisor, Alexandra Patsavas, because she is an absolute legend. She oversaw production and assembled all 5 of these soundtracks, and I just think she did a really, really good job. She took it as an important role to not just crank out the top 40 names at the time. You saw Twilight very early on adopting exclusives. I'm talking tracks from Thom, Yorke. The Killers are contributing exclusives here. These aren't just nobodies. You're getting everybody on board. And the fact that people were able to put down their fragile masculinity, their ego, whatever it was, they bit the bullet and contributed to something that was bigger than themselves because they knew that it was about turning people on to the music. I think I made my point crystally, diamondy, vampire clear. So if you enjoy the rest of this video, please do me a favor, stop and hit that like button, and let's start putting these albums on the tier list and giving a little review of each soundtrack. One of the things that I love about the Twilight soundtracks is the fact that they progress and evolve and kind of fit with the character of Bella and the rest of the cast getting older, they're going through high school, maybe their tastes are changing a bit, and this first movie has a little bit more on the pop punk and emo side, along with the indie and alternative tendencies. This is tapped into even more as the franchise keeps going, but here in the early days, we have not one, but two exclusive songs from Paramore, both of which are god-tier cuts. I mean, Decode is one of their best songs ever, objectively, and I caught myself. It's so vividly personal from Hayley Williams. It works in the soundtrack, and it absolutely cuts still to this day. But something you're gonna hear me parrot as we go through all of these soundtracks is that it's not just about the big artist. I think those are there to serve as kind of the clickbait to get you to check out the rest and to see how they work in the context of the movie or outside of the context. You've got Muse, you've got Paramore, you've got the awesome baseball scene, genuinely my favorite thing from the entire Twilight film series, like the actual on-screen stuff. Some of the stuff still isn't even on streaming, like the track from Perri of Jane's Addiction, and we've also got a song from Iron and Wine that's become very, very famous, not just because of this one, but also the final movie, Flightless Bird, American Mouth. The original soundtrack is really good, but not the best one overall, and I think I'm gonna put this one in the A tier.
Drunken salesman, your hair in damage, your mind is restless, they say you're getting better.
I was paying attention even as a teenager. By the time that the soundtrack for part 2 came out, I was wanting to see if any of the bands that I was interested in, like The Killers or Death Cab for Cutie, were gonna have some banging songs on there, and what do you know, they did. Meet Me on the Equinox, a White Demon love song, an underrated and forgotten about Killers song lives on this soundtrack. I think it can only be found on YouTube. I'm not trying to be overzealous in selling you on this, but holy shit, this soundtrack is lights out fantastic. Licky Lee, Hurricane Bells, Black Rebel Motorcycle Club, The Killers, Thom, Yorke, Band of Skulls. The hits do not stop coming, and it's such a wide variety, but it flows and meshes together so perfectly. Good God, the list just keeps going on. Okay, go. Grizzly Bear featuring Victoria from Beach House. Editors made the cut for the soundtrack too. This is like an indie music starter pack, and if this got you into indie or alternative, please do not feel any shame, because this soundtrack, in all of its glory for New Moon, it goes all the way up at the S tier.
Rolling in on a burning tire, you're gonna set my house on fire.
I don't know how they kept outdoing themselves, but I think as the franchise got more successful, they had access to more artists, their ears and their bank accounts were open, and of course we got an incredible outing on Eclipse once again. Original songs came from Metric with Eclipse, All Yours, a fantastic cut. They were really thriving in the early 2010s between that and Scott Pilgrim. Hours by The Bravery, Heavy in Your Arms, which was my personal introduction to Florence and the Machine, Rolling In on a Burning Tire by The Dead Weather. This was the main movie that I remember in the franchise because this was at the height of when I was actually working as the person who would clean out the theaters, and I'd be standing in the back waiting for the movie to end, and the lights would come up so I could start sweeping and picking up everybody's trash. Well, I would always hear Heavy in Your Arms and What Part of Forever by CeeLo Green in the credits, and I grew to love both of those songs dearly. It made me check out the entire soundtrack. I discovered some amazing music. It was really a reintroduction to Beck for me, and also Bats for Lashes. They have an incredible song. Vampire Weekender here, it totally makes sense with a cut called Jonathan Lowe. I hadn't heard some of these songs in years, but coming back now, I just am dumbfounded at how good they actually made this soundtrack. I'm just gonna be honest here, I'm not quite sure between New Moon and Eclipse which one is my favorite, considering I love so many songs from both, but it's definitely going up there in the S tier.
You walk away, every day it'll rain.
With the way the trends in music were kind of changing around the early 2010s, there was this club boom, but also the indie peak that was kind of rivaling that. I think we kind of got congested on the final two soundtracks for Breaking Dawn. But I do like a lot of songs on both. It's just that they're much more hit or miss, and I think they do kind of reflect the more serious tone, especially in the first movie. In the second one, you got the wedding and everything, but here in part 1, I think it gets off to a very, very solid start. You've got original music from The Joy Formidable, Angus and Julia Stone, and Bruno Mars. All 3 of those songs, the first 3 on the track list, are just so good in their own way, especially The Joy Formidable. They're incredibly overlooked. Regardless of how you feel, 1,000 Years by Christina Perri is here, and she was riding the success of her single Jar of Hearts. This track was massive. It got a sequel in part 2 because part 1, part 2, Breaking Dawn part 1, and then also this Christina Perri song part 1 and 2. This is much more of a mood soundtrack, and it can be to its detriment. I do think that there's lulls and also dull moments that just don't really pique your curiosity for repeated listens, but still, even if this is something that you just threw on in the background, I don't think it would be that bad of an experience. I just so happen to think it's the worst in the soundtrack franchise, and I'm gonna put it down there in the C.
Don't look away from the arms of love.
And finally, we arrive at the Breaking Dawn Part 2 soundtrack, and I remember feeling so torn because at the time, in 2012 when this came out, it was so popular to slam dunk on Twilight, on Kristen Stewart, on Robert Pattinson, on whoever plays Jacob, the kid from Shark Boy and Lava Girl. This was something that I felt an internal conflict on because my favorite band, Green Day, contributed a song, The Forgotten. St. Vincent has an incredible song called The Antidote here, and I also really like the opening cut Passion Pit, Where I Come From. It opens up the movie. It's a little bit more upbeat and peppy, and it shows you a tonal shift in the films. Breaking Dawn Part 2's soundtrack is not bulletproof in the way that the early ones were, but I do think this was a bit of a step up, at least from Part 1. I like certain moments. There's other underrated tracks like from Reeve Carney, and also Part 2 of the 1,000 Years song. It's okay, it's sappy, but I kinda like it. I don't know, think I'm feeling generous. I'm gonna put this one up there in the B tier, and there is my overall ranking for all of the soundtracks. Ladies, gents, vampires, werewolves, and everyone in between, what do you think of this weird dichotomy that exists between the soundtracks to the movies, which objectively are maybe not that great, they definitely have their market, but the soundtracks that carved out something a little bit deeper and tried to show emotion on screen by selecting some really thoughtful tunes?